Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to begin. Please find your seats. We're going to get started. I want to welcome everyone to this side event on advancing the just transition for climate change impact and resilience. We are delighted to organize this with IPECA, World Steel, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, among other partners of the Major Economies Business Forum. My name is Noreen Kennedy, Senior Vice President for Policy and Global Strategy at the United States Council for International Business, also known as USCIB. We represent our members, Fortune 500 companies, in the multilateral system through the affiliations we have with the International Chamber of Commerce, the International Organization of Employers, and Business and Industry at the OECD. Climate change has been a consistent priority for my organization since the pre-COP days, without disclosing my age, and we are very proud to be one of the founding partners of the Major Economies Business Forum. So what is the Major Economies Business Forum, also known as BISMEF? It's a partnership of major multi-sectoral business organizations from not just the major economies, but really important economies all over the world in OECD and non-OECD countries. And what we have in common across this very diverse group is that our multi-sectoral and global perspective reflects the economy-wide approach that is required to rise to the climate challenge. Our main visibility as BISMEF has been in organizing business dialogues at the COP, Doha, Warsaw, Lima, Katowice, and Madrid, as well as a virtual dialogue in Glasgow. And just this past Saturday, our 11th dialogue here on this subject, kindly hosted by our newest partner in BISMEF, the Federation of Egyptian Industry. Our subject matter today is just transition for climate impact and resilience. It's a set of issues at the crossroads of so many key challenges for this region, for the Paris Agreement, for the reality of climate change impacts, and for the inclusive and sustainable recovery we all need. COP27 occurs as the world faces a set of intertwined challenges, both inside this process as well as in the global community. And the challenge of just transition has grown beyond supporting workers to take on a wider significance for all of society as we navigate the multiple challenges of food and energy insecurity, economic turbulence, and political polarization. This side event will reflect an emphasis on implementation plus. What do we mean by this? Implementation plus reflects accelerated and mainstream business action and partnership across every facet of policy to deliver on climate goals and pledges, complementing what governments do. But it is more than that, because we need a new chapter of accelerated action and resource deployment, advancing mitigation and adaptation cost effectively while also creating opportunities to meet energy and employment needs. So as we talk today about advancing mitigation and adaptation, we also need to think about food, water, and energy security, with a special focus on the development challenges faced by the African region. And clearly, business across all sectors will be an essential player in all of these. So as COP27 is labeled the implementation COP, and we look ahead to COP28 as the stock take COP, we're really looking already at what it is that we can draw attention to in terms of opportunities for progress. In what ways can business be measured against our own commitment metrics? And what do developing regions like Africa see as their key metrics to be achieved or still needing advancement? Also, noting that many countries are working on climate strategies far beyond this year's COP27 negotiations, what are the biggest targets that businesses and governments alike can start working on together towards next year's COP to ensure that we are moving the needle forward on these key climate discussions? To help us answer all of those questions and then some, I'm pleased to introduce our first speakers. The Honorable Monica Medina, Assistant Secretary of State from the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs for the State Department, and also Special Envoy for Biodiversity and Nature. Welcome, Monica, in conversation with Marty Durbin, Senior Vice President for Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So please welcome our first two guests.
Thank you, Noreen. And let me also first just thank our partners here today at USCIB, World Steel, and IPECA. And I have to specifically say that, Noreen, you've just been such an incredible resource for the business community in Washington for a long time. Again, I won't talk about our ages either, but I've been working with Noreen for a long time in Washington, D.C. So I want to start with, Monica, just to recognize and acknowledge that this is Gender Day, and I think we can be really pleased and impressed at the distinguished women leaders that we've seen all through the COP, and from many nations, and of course I include you in that, Monica. And so talking about leadership, just kind of starting with that, I wanted to thank you for your leadership in helping us. You worked with the business community, with the United States Senate, with other stakeholders to finally see enactment or ratification of the Kigali Treaty. So we know how hard any treaty can be to get done, so congratulations with that.
Thank you. We're very excited to get that.
I don't think we have this microphone turned on, so let's see. Is there a... Is that working now? Here. Well, here. In the meantime, let me give you this one.
Yeah. We'll share. Sharing is a good thing. Thank you so much for that very nice introduction to both of you, and thanks for letting me be here to talk about all the things that the U.S. is doing to help this be an implementation plus COP. And I'm glad we started with gender. It is Gender Day. We had a great event earlier in the U.S. Center. We have brought a slew of women leaders from our government here, including Ambassador Sam Power. The Energy Secretary Jen Granholm will be here, and we had Speaker Pelosi, and we've had the involvement of Vice President Harris. So we know that when women lead, they're really wonderful climate solutions are the result. And it's not just me saying it. There are studies that actually show that when women leaders are in power, climate solutions are more effective in the countries that they lead, and everyone benefits from that. So I'm very glad to be here and to be talking with you today on Gender Day.
So COP26 was a COP that was focused on commitments and mitigation. This year what we've seen is more as a focus on implementation and adaptation. Resilience being a big part of that, and of course a big part of what you work on yourself. We know the President has announced his President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, and I was hoping we could just count on you to kind of tell us what it is and where we're going with that.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled to talk about it. I love the acronym. It's called PREPARE, which is great because it really emphasizes the need to get ahead of these climate crises as best we can. And we know that for every dollar we spend in advance to try to prepare for climate crises and climate stress around the world, we save $6 on the back end. And that's really important because it gives us more money to spend on the things that we need to do in order to be ready for the climate crisis. So what are the dollars and cents? What are the numbers behind the PREPARE program? We are committed in the Biden administration to working with Congress to get a $3 billion annually adaptation finance funded for this PREPARE program by 2024. And that would represent a 6-fold increase in our work on adaptation from the highest levels of funding in the past. And what that means is really a big difference to people and communities. This is about helping communities be ready for the climate stress that we know is happening. And we know that it's so important. I used to work in the government agency NOAA, where we give weather warnings just on a routine basis. So many businesses around the world, so many people around the world depend on that kind of weather warnings, watches, and information that we take for granted in the United States, but many, many other countries don't have. So we're determined to bring funding from the U.S. government, to bring our know-how, to leverage the work that we can do in our government on improving weather models and forecasts so we can help other countries improve their forecasts on things like storm surge or drought and even weather-related diseases that we know we can predict accurately now if we have the information and we can provide it to countries that are stressed by climate. So our money, our know-how, and then leveraging the finance and the abilities of the private sector, which is crucial to finding the solutions that we need for the climate crisis.
Well, let's pick up on that. If we take the Prepare program itself, but then also focus on, as Noreen mentioned, you're recently appointed as Special Presidential Envoy for Biodiversity and Water Resources. So how do we take those types of roles here and link them to work in Africa here and being able to address issues like water scarcity and others around the continent?
So we know that water scarcity or too much water can be a terrible, terrible problem for countries to deal with. And in fact, they're a cause of insecurity and even conflict increasingly around the world. And we have to get ahead of that. So this is so important. It's one of the things that we're working on in the Biden administration. That's why I was appointed the envoy for biodiversity and water resources, which is a key part of what I hope to be doing in the next year. The UN will have a Global Water Day in New York in March, and we hope that we can elevate these water issues. And I'll just tell you, we have a lot of expertise, again, in the U.S. government. People like the Army Corps of Engineers and our Bureau of Reclamation. Some of our government agencies are expert in understanding water and how it flows, but we also have to understand how to get ahead of places where we know there might be conflicts across borders about water. And we even know that sometimes that challenges us in the United States in places like the Colorado River system, in which we know we need water for important big cities like Denver and Los Angeles, and for farmers, and we also need to share that water with Mexico. So increasingly we see cross-border water stress as something that we need to be able to protect and get ahead of. And I'll just end by saying the other night we were at an event that you all sponsored, and I happened to sit next to a business leader from here in Egypt who talked about the importance of concessionary finance to close the gap in water costs, which is one of the ways that we think we can be helpful in the U.S. through using our government dollars to help leverage finance for better water systems in terms of desal and reuse. There's all kinds of new technologies that we are bringing to bear. In a place like Sharm el-Sheikh, this wouldn't exist if it weren't for desalination, and his company was one of the ones integrally involved, and we know we need those systems in more and more places around the world every day. So thank you for that question.
Absolutely. We were at an event earlier today where one of the panelists was saying that of three words that weren't in the declaration last year, among them were food and water, and recognizing the importance that that plays in the whole climate picture as well. You mentioned the event the other night, and we were very honored to have the Secretary join us for that. To me, the themes, and certainly I'd be remiss as the Chamber of Commerce for not saying this, but we really appreciated elevating the role that the private sector has to play. You've mentioned it as well. So I was curious, from a perception as you're talking to others around the COP. We've seen the evolution that even Secretary Kerry mentioned, from Paris to Glasgow to here, and what we expect to go forward. As I said the other night, I'm very excited about the level of engagement from the business community who's really trying to leverage these opportunities. But I want to get your thoughts on that too. We had such a great model on the Kigali Treaty. What else should we be working on?
Well, there's so much we can work on together, and I think when you put together the ingenuity and the sort of the power of American business and entrepreneurship up against these climate challenges, we are going to find the solutions. President Biden says this all the time. While it is a terrible challenge that we're up against with climate, we also have to turn it into that fantastic opportunity, that engine for growth. And we know not only in the U.S., but around the world, it means tremendous opportunities. We have to make sure there's a just transition. This very event is about that. Make sure that communities that are have been in traditionally fossil fuel industries need to have that just transition to find new ways for them to participate and be winners in the new energy economy. So we are, and that's not just in the US, that's around the world. The Kigali Amendment is a perfect example. It's really about air conditioning and refrigeration, something that we know we're going to need more and more and more of in the future as the world gets warmer and warmer. At 1.5 degrees, or as close as we can to that, we're still going to have a huge amount of warming baked into the climate for the entire planet. And that means places like this need more air conditioning, more cooling in order to protect medicines or to keep people from working in unsafe conditions. So we know the importance of that, which is why the Kigali Amendment, I think, got through Congress with an overwhelming bipartisan support. You know, in the Senate, a treaty needs 2/3 majority in order to pass. And we had a number of Republican senators supported, along with most, I think, all the Democrats. So it was a great show of how when businesses get together and with the government, and we show that there is a benefit to U.S. businesses, and we knew that the Kigali Amendment and its domestic implementing legislation was creating jobs. Jobs all around the country, developing air conditioning systems that we can then export. And I'll tell you, the first day at COP, we opened the U.S. Center with an event, and one of the leading companies there was Johnson Controls. They make air conditioners, and they were here in the region to talk about the 6 plants they're opening. So connecting this back to Africa, this is about jobs in Africa as well. It's U.S. technology. We're exporting to places like this that need it the most, creating jobs in the U.S. and Africa. If that's not a win-win, I don't know what is.
Excellent. No, that's really helpful. And again, as you said, whether we're talking about the finance needs that have been a big topic here, or just to be able to spur along the innovation we know is necessary to meet the ambitious emission goals, it does take a true partnership. That's why I think another constant theme from the business community has been recognition and appreciation for legislation, the laws that we now have in place, mostly bipartisan, for the Infrastructure Law, Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, that are providing the kinds of clear market signals for the private sector to say, good for us, we can lean in here. I mean, they're already primed to do it. Providing even better incentives for them, I think is a path that's going to show incredible progress as we move forward here.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about last year being one of the first COPs with businesses all in, and we started something called the First Movers Coalition last year. And in the year since we kicked that off, we've had dozens of companies come forward because they know it's good for business and it's good for the planet. What a wonderful thing. We hope to continue to sign up businesses to be a part of the solution here, and for every COP going forward that we can work together. And I can tell you, it's not just here. We are starting the negotiation of another global agreement that I hope will be a lot like this one, a bottom-up agreement where nations come together with plans on plastic pollution. We are drowning in plastic pollution all around the world. And last March in Nairobi, Kenya, at the United Nations Environment Program's meeting, where we look at environmental problems that are facing the world, we passed a resolution to kick off an ambitious effort to negotiate a global agreement on plastic pollution. Think about plastic. It's in all our lives. We can't live without it, and yet we are drowning in it. We need to find ways to reduce, reuse, and recycle plastic much more effectively than we have before. Waste is bad. We know waste is bad. We can't afford to just toss single-use plastic bottles in the trash. It's really so devastating in small developing countries and island states, and this is a place where we hope to work with businesses, and it's really one of the places where I've seen the most unity between business groups and environmental groups and community groups, state and local governments, the federal government. We need to get together to come up with solutions on plastic pollution and drive innovation, hopefully by getting the best of American technology, the best American entrepreneurs, the best young people who see this as a great challenge for them and bring them into the negotiation process. We've been reaching out to everyone we possibly can, so we hope to be working with the Chamber and so many businesses to come up with the solution we need by 2024, negotiate this agreement, and launch ourselves into a less plastic-intense world.
Yeah, well, you can count on us being a partner there. I know it's certainly it's on the agenda from the member companies. I know, and it kind of takes me back to whether we're talking about environmental objectives like that, or we get to again ambitious climate objectives. Our view of the Chamber has been, that let's set ambitious goals, but understand that we're going to need technology, policy, and market signals that will facilitate the private sector making those investments. I think we're starting to see that. I know we came in, I think all of our partners came into this COP in a very optimistic way, saying, our member companies are leaning in, and how do we now continue that progress, build on that momentum. So to wrap us up here, I wanted to, number one, ask you, if anything else you wanted to make sure you shared with us here today, but also kind of been asking as we wrap up other conversations, what's the one thing that really excites you about the momentum and the path we're on here to make progress toward these really ambitious goals?
I'll tell you, the one place where I'm looking forward to working even more with business, besides plastic pollution, which is one of them, is on nature-based solutions, on adaptation and resilience. This is, as we started out talking about this being the implementation plus COP, and that's about adaptation and resilience, and there's a huge role for businesses to play in that. It seems like nature is something we kind of take for granted often, but business runs on the natural resources and a healthy planet, and when we get businesses involved in helping us conserve nature, we have a biodiversity crisis that's fueled by our climate crisis, and our climate crisis is really undermining the planet's health and driving that biodiversity crisis even more strongly. So when we can find a way for businesses to be nature positive, and I had a great meeting earlier this week with one of the largest banks in the US that's anxious to fund nature solutions because they know all their other investments depend on a healthy planet. So it's been great to talk with them. I'm really excited about finding ways to take the cost of development and sustainability and put it back into the system and try and keep the planet healthy so we all have air to breathe and water to drink and all the things that we need to keep ourselves sustained into the future and businesses going in the future.
Well, Madam Assistant Secretary Monica, I want to thank you. Again, you can count on us. We look forward to working with you as partners. And if I could ask everyone to join me in thanking Assistant Secretary Medina. I'm going to leave the one working microphone up here.
Okay, I think now it's working. Well, thank you all for joining us for this panel, which will cover the just transition and resilient goals. I am also, first of all, want to sort of thank our co-partners, organizations for these events for sort of bringing these voices and this conversation today. Ensuring a just transition is one of the priority items for COP27, with the presidency calling for inclusive dialogue among all parties to support the transition to low-carbon economy, in which the benefits of the energy transition are shared equitably among all, while ensuring that climate action is anchored in concern for people and communities. My name is Isabel Miranda, and I represent IPICA. For those who don't know IPICA, IPICA is an oil and gas industry association that advances sustainability and social performance, and we are very active in the just transition space, and really delighted to be able to convene this dialogue today. This is sort of what we feel this is really important to advance this dialogue. I am delighted to have a really interesting lineup of speakers today to join us today. So I'm going to go and introduce very briefly the speakers that we have today. And I will start with Mr. Anibor Kraga, and if you like, perhaps to join me to the as part of the panel. So Anibor is the Executive Secretary for the African Refiners and Distributors Association. He is currently the Executive Secretary of the African Energy Distributors Association, ARDA. And this is the first ever Pan-African organization for the downstream oil sector in Africa, and a position that he has held since April 2020. Mr. Kraga also served as the president of ARDA from March 2019 to 2020. And prior to that, he was Chief Operating Officer for the Refineries and Petrochemicals Directorate of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation. Welcome. Our next speaker that I would like to introduce is Mr. Nimpini Mambunda, who is the CEO for the Southern Africa for General Electric. Welcome. Mr. Mabunda is the CEO, as I mentioned, for the Southern Africa at General Electric, with over 25 plus years of background leading consumer goods, food franchise and telecom business across Africa, the United Kingdom. Before joining General Electric, he fulfilled roles as the country divisional CEO level for two major multinational businesses, Vodafone and Diageo. He also has ample expertise in strategy, marketing, sales, and sort of an impressive track record in terms of driving results and talent development. So welcome very much to our panel. Our next speaker is Farouk Ullah. Farouk is a strategist at the B team. And he advances the work of the B team on climate, nature, and inequalities by guiding companies and governments to show sustainability leadership. Welcome, Farouk. And before we start, and I know we are one of our panelists that is here, so please, Nadira, I'm going to introduce you to our panel. So Nadira is the economic advisor in the Commonwealth Secretariat's Ocean and Natural Resources Advisory Division. She has over 20 years of experience in the energy and extractive sector and provides technical advice to governments in sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Her work includes supporting countries in policy formulation, design of fiscal, legal, and regulatory frameworks, capacity building, and managing the energy transition. Nadira also co-organizes the New Producers Group, which is a steering committee member of the OECD-led initiative to develop an inclusive, equitable framework for a just transition in resource-rich developing countries. So a really interesting panel. Welcome all of you. So I think I'm going to start by asking, and probably I will start with Nadia first, in terms of what does the sort of energy transition from a global perspective means, and maybe sort of what it means for your organization?
Thanks so much for that. What might appear as a simple question, but really a tough one. And the reason for that is the Commonwealth Secretariat is a voluntary organization, intergovernmental organization of 56 countries. And in that, we have really a microcosm of the world. We have developed and advanced economies, we have small island developing states, we have least developed countries, we have resource-rich countries, both in terms of fossil fuels and non-fossil fuels, and we have resource-poor countries. Again, energy import, export. So we have quite a really complex dynamic within the Commonwealth Secretariat. And we are an organization that is based on consensus. So one voice, the smallest country, has the same voice as the largest, which is quite unique in a way. So from that perspective, we really are all around trying to understand the various positions within the countries and trying to assist them. So within that space, we are doing multiple things because, again, this question of just and equitable transition means different things to different people. And one thing, that's really interesting is when we say just, it means if you're a resource exporter, let's say fossil fuel based, that's very highly dependent on coal, that means something very different for someone who is a least developed country that has no energy, facing energy access, energy poverty, high levels of debt. It's very different. So the elements of trying to support countries, we look at things very much in terms of country-led and country-driven. So the issues of climate impact, debt, loss and adaptation, each of these countries have their own challenges. So we have, working with countries, multiple programs, one called the Climate Finance Access Hub, which works with many developing countries to actually secure finance, which, as we know, is a critical issue for many countries. We also have a sustainable energy transitions agenda, which is working on various specific items to assist governments in understanding the transition and preparing for it. And we also have recently signed, countries have come together and signed a Living Lands Charter, which again is looking at nature-based solutions and protecting biodiversity. So it's a very wide cross-section, just recognizing energy transition and justice and equitable and inclusive really requires all players coming around the table and working together. So hopefully that gives a flavor for what we're looking and working with countries in.
Thank you very much, Nadia. I would like to turn to Anibor and sort of what is your expectation, COP taking place in Africa? What does the just energy transition means for Africa?
Thank you very much, Isabel. I think to put everything in context, I'll start with a little paragraph from an article that my President Muhammadu Buhari, actually issued last week. And it goes like this: part of my nation is underwater. Seasonal flooding is normal in Nigeria, but not like this. 34 of the country's 36 states have been affected and more than 1.4 million people have been displaced. Together with drought-driven famine in the Horn of Africa, cascading wildfires across the north, and wave upon wave of intensifying cyclones in the south, climate disasters in Africa form the backdrop of this year's COP27. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa has only contributed 2.73% of the global cumulative CO2 emissions to date. 2.73% versus 33% for the EU and 29% for North America and Asia together. So the question is, when you're talking just transition, should we be looking at the same energy transition as envisioned by resource-rich countries that actually are actually looking more to regulate fossil fuel-related economies, or what's actually necessary for us here. A just transition in Africa should focus on the entire value chain and ensuring that we balance energy poverty with climate requirements. A just transition for Africa requires that the development funders who are critical for ensuring that we deliver on our climate agenda give us funding for agendas that we want, not prescriptive agendas saying, if you don't invest in solar or wind, we're not going to give you money. When you look at what has happened in recent years, where development funders are basically using the same brush on all fossil fuel related projects. It doesn't matter whether it's the upstream oil or coal projects, or whether it's a gas project to add power to the national grid. Just transition means that we should also be looking at the entire value chain for Africa. We should not just be consumers of materials. We should be producers, we should be manufacturers, we should be establishing research hubs and the like. So for me, as ARDA, just transition also means looking at more carbon adaptation strategies versus carbon mitigation. We're the 2.73% emitters, ladies and gentlemen. As a result, we should be looking at decarbonizing our existing operations. We should be looking at new lower carbon infrastructure like LPG and gas processing facilities, as well as other renewable things. So bottom line, just transition means reframing what climate justice currently means and ensuring that we as Africa are put in the best position to meet our climate targets while also ensuring that we deal with our energy poverty requirements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanipur. I am now going to hand over to Farouk. As the B team is focused on support business leadership to drive systemic change, what is the role of business in accelerating a just transition?
Sorry. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for having me. I have to admit, I was a late addition to the speaking panel, so I haven't prepared any notes. I will do my best.
Thank you.
The B team is a global alliance of business and civil society leaders. We are a founding member of the We Mean Business Coalition. The whole theory of change that we try to employ is something called the ambition loop, which is that business action, progressive business action, can stimulate and drive the enabling public policy environment by which business can take further action. And the wheel spins around in a great, exciting infinity loop. To that end, we see business as a thought leader, but also an advocate. But to be a credible advocate, we also need to get our own house in order. To that point, we really believe that key to all of these things around the just transition is the core of a social dialogue. To that point, we really need to kind of engage with not only workers, but also communities. The just transition is, of course, a concentric ring. You start with your operations, you then move to your supply chains, and then you work on the communities that sit around side of it. I think that business itself will be very, very important in trying to find solutions. That is critical. At the same time, we really need to push governments to do better. I quite commonly find that the just transition conversation dead ends on the role of government. And yet, we don't have a salient, universal public policy ask for governments of what they need to do to enable a just transition. Right now, all I can see is governments wanting to talk about jet Ps. I have to say, a jet P is a completely unproven model at best. At worst, it's a flawed model. And we need to do better. To that end, it's very clear that public finance alone will not be enough to enable a just transition. So the role of business goes beyond just delivering a just transition, but also enabling a just transition, specifically through finance and investment. It's going to be very interesting. We'll probably see tomorrow the announcement of 2 more jet Ps, Indonesia and I think India. I can't really remember my intel now, I'm sorry. With Senegal coming in a few days after. This is a huge opportunity. But at the moment, there is not either a system or incentivization for business to invest in the just transition on scale. Another key point to note here is there's different types of just transition, and we conflate and confuse them. Jet Ps are about just transition between countries, What's also really critical and the core of just transition is the just transition within countries. That is really critical. And that cuts back to the ILO, ITUC definitions, which is centered around the social dialogue, which requires trust. Therefore, trust building is absolutely essential. And there are ways to do these things. We can make decisions. I've developed 5 criteria for understanding how to address the transition, but also deliver equitable energy access. There is a reason and a way to do this, and the 5 criteria are: any new form of energy development must obey 5 things. The first is it must constitute significant emissions reductions. The second is it cannot encourage or create stranded assets and lock in. The third is any investment must have an equitable percentage towards renewables. That gives a pathway and avoids the stranded asset lock-in point of criteria 2. The fourth, and I'm going to forget them now because I'm doing this off the top of my head, so bear with me. The fourth is around ensuring that you meet other sustainability goals and standards. So for example, for the 600 and I believe 50 million Africans now who live without energy access, who rely on solid fuels, that includes reducing deforestation by giving them modern energy access and reducing health impacts from indoor cooking around solid fuels. I cannot remember the 5th one now. I'll come back to you in a second, and I'm sorry again. But these things are really critical. And in this case, you cannot have a single policy for the entire world. It needs to be contextualized. And in this context, I believe that even potentially Africans getting natural gas could constitute all 4, potentially 5 criteria, including emissions reductions. That's the key. And if you can satisfy these 5 conditions, that is a just transition. Sorry, the 5th point was equitable and affordable energy access. I regard energy as a 21st century basic human need. However, it is not a human right. It should be. We need the human right to sustainable energy. That is the only medium-term structural solution to the energy crisis. I'll stop there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Farouk. And I think for my next speaker, and I think it's a very interesting segue in terms of looking at the sort of just energy transition plans, and maybe I know you've been involved with the recent plans for South Africa, so which I think are probably going to be a blueprint in terms of how other governments will go ahead. Can you tell us a little bit more, and maybe some of the lessons that you have already sort of learned from this process?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me here. So our President Ramaphosa, last week, he was here at COP27, and he launched the JETP financing plan, which he handed over to the funders, because many of you would remember that in COP26, there was a funding made available of $8.5 billion to support the first phase for South Africa just energy transition, as one of the most carbon-intensive country with over 80% coal generation of power. So this year, the president then launched that financing plan, which showed what the shortfall is. So just for perspective, where we had $8.5 billion, but the plan shows that we will need $100 billion to get there. It's a serious constraint and challenge for small markets like South Africa to then say, how do you fund the difference? And how much of that is from the private sector, how much is from the government, how much of that comes concessional or loans and so on. But what I really want to touch on is the role of the private sector, which I represent as a CEO for GE, as well as chairing the US South Africa Business Council, which is part of the US Chamber, where we said as business, we cannot sit by the sideline and watch. We need to contribute to this plan because the plan affects the environment in which we operate as business. It also affects the people that we employ, and it also affects our ability to have a country that we're in as an investment destination. So this is not just for the country and for the government, but private sector need to play an active role. Earlier today at the South African Pavilion, business launched the South Africa Net Zero Transition Plan, and which includes how it's going to be funded, how the country will get to 2050 net zero, and what action business needs to do as the private sector. Now, the way this was done is that we actually brought an aggregator, because as business we can have many different opinions, but we partnered with, of course, the National Business Initiative, which is a business association in South Africa, so coming together of all of the business as a sponsor. We then brought the expertise of Boston Consulting Group, who actually led the research into the work, because we wanted to make the discussion fact-based. How much will it cost? What is the energy mix that we need? And then more importantly to this conversation, the social impact. South Africa is in a very, very difficult situation where we're talking about a country with over 30% unemployment rate today. A country where for the last 5 years we've only managed a GDP growth of 1%, which means in real terms we've gone backwards. We're talking about one of the highest, if not the highest, inequality in the world. And therefore, how does this JP add to all of that? And skill deficit. So when you talk about jobs as one of the largest producers of coal and exporters of coal, coal directly employs about 300,000 people. And if you look at a ratio of 1 to 7 in terms of employed and people that you support, we're talking about 2 million lives impacted. So how do you make sure that you don't just think about protecting the coal jobs, but creating new industries? And one of the things that came out of this plan was how feasible and exciting it is to develop the hydrogen opportunity for South Africa. And if you do that right, of which we have many capabilities, we can more than offset the jobs at risk. And secondly, the opportunity that comes with the building of the infrastructure for renewables, because we need to build about 6 to 7 gigawatts of new generation every year for the next 10 years. That can stimulate our economy. So we try to look at it glass half full and say, what are the opportunities around this? And with the climate that we have, with the skill that we have, and with the location that we have, how can we turn this into an advantage? Because we need it for sustainability.
Thank you very much for that answer. I would like to perhaps, and this is to Mr. Nimpini again, maybe ask you another question, which I know you wrote quite a lot about leadership. So to me, it's like, from your perspective, what does it mean, and you are the CEO of a leading organization, what does it mean in terms of leadership to sort of the change mindsets to achieve a just transition?
I think there's a couple of things that is important. I think as leaders, we need to be conversant about the issues facing the countries where we operate as far as the just transition is concerned. What are the opportunities and what are the risks? But also champion it from the front, because I think it's something that we all need for sustainability. Now, one of the key things, for instance, in my role, from a South African point of view, is to then say, I've got, as an example, South Africa produces 80% of its electricity, about 88% from coal. GE has got a huge installed base in that space. Now, I have people who are working, large teams that are working in that space. What are they thinking about their future? And here, repurposing and reskilling and having conversations about skills of the future is very important in terms of our people. Because for us to grab the opportunities in renewable, and we are leading in energy transition as GE worldwide, we have to think about the skills that are needed. So we focus a lot of time in terms of skilling. The second thing in terms of leading is that recognize the opportunity or the position that the private sector is sitting in. In many cases, in the private sector, we have the kind of knowledge and skill based on the research and our global footprint, which perhaps even some of our government do not have. So we can share that learning. So we've taken, for instance, some of our customers to overseas operations, to go and see how you can repurpose a coal power station into renewable. So sharing of knowledge, demystify, and make people understand what are the challenges, what are some of the opportunities. And then lastly, it's about the communities. So understanding, being good citizens in the communities where we do business. So really understanding some of the adaptations and resilience needs in the communities where we operate, and making sure that as part of our social investment, we invest in the right areas that prepares us for that future. So for us in GE, for example, we've chosen education, and we've launched a GE Next Engineers, because we're going to need more and more engineers into the future, and this is at a high school level, focusing particularly on women engineers. You'll be surprised, or maybe not, that in South Africa, as an example, there's 110,000 registered engineers, of which on this gender day, only 10% are women. So our Next Engineers program has got deliberately a 70% intake being women, because we need to change that for sustainability. We need to broaden that participation. So education, health, investment for sustainability is very important, but I have to lead it from the top.
Do you want to?
Thank you very much for sharing with us the South Africa case, which I think is very peculiar, but I think I was very proud about what President Ramaphosa did last year, and the fact that it's getting actualized. But I represent quite a few countries across Africa. My base is in Cote d'Ivoire. I'm Nigerian, but I have refineries all over the continent. The challenge is that the private sector, very well-meaning, and I think you're going to do the best you can, but fundamentally, you have to do things for profit, right? And you need funding to actually deliver on this mandate, right? And the reality is that, I think since COP 15? There was a pledge of $100 billion a year that was supposed to be coming into Africa to help us with the energy transition. Only a fraction of that has come to date. On top of that, majority of the development finance institutions, or DFIs, which are actually supposed to be the first moving capital that will actually anchor the private capital coming in, those DFIs are given prescriptive instructions not to support fossil fuel industries and all of that. So you have a situation where in Africa, even on these gas flare eliminations and things that could actually help African countries on this path to energy transition, you have a situation where there are only two DFIs really that are funding this, Afreximbank and Africa Finance Corporation. The rest of the DFIs more or less have instructions from their sponsors not to invest in oil and gas or fossil fuel projects. A wide brush, which doesn't make any sense. There are actually 67 DFIs in Africa. When you look at the Association of African DFIs, when you add associate members, there are 80 DFIs, but we only hear of 2. How are we actually going to actualize this in a meaningful way if we don't have conduits for the funding to actually anchor these programs we're trying to do? So in my view, I think there needs to be a concerted effort in actually working with coalescing our DFIs and upscaling them to actually start to help the Gs of the world to actualize. You talked about $8.5 billion, but the need is $100 billion. Where's the delta going to come from? Okay, and how are we going to come up with a decade-by-decade finance plan to support these development plans such that the investments can come as and when required to deliver on this? Because any project without financing is just an idea, right? So I don't want us to come to COP28 in Dubai next year and the year after that and be talking about the fact that, oh yes, it took a whole year from agreeing 8.5 billion to actualize. And I know it wasn't, so how do we move faster? How do we get a situation where financing is in place when it's required? That, for me, is my biggest challenge. Coming back to where I'm sitting. Refineries, people ask, refineries and energy transition, what does it mean for the world? Let's talk about what refineries can do. One, refineries are major CO2 emitters. They can be part of the carbon capture and sequestration discussion. But guess what? No African DFI will give them money because we're refineries. Refineries produce wastewater that can be used for reforestation, right? That's carbon sequestration. But if a refinery project comes forward, we don't get money. So fundamentally, I keep coming back to the financing standpoint. how are we going to put in place a finance plan that supports companies like GE with noble intentions to actually deliver on the delta that is actually required and serves as a conduit for the $100 billion a year that was promised to Africa to deliver on our targets. It's not going to happen by accident. And we need a deliberate path to actually make this happen. And I'm hoping that moving on from COP27, which is the implementation COP, right? You can't implement without financing. There needs to be a clear plan on how this funding is going to come and what projects it will support on the just transition spectrum, which I believe for Africa, as the 2.73% contributors, should focus significantly on adaptation, like you're talking about, and less on mitigation, because you're not mitigating much in Africa. I think the numbers have shown that California uses more electricity on video games in 1 year than all of Kenya. That's a fact. So when you're talking of, but what we need to do is adapt what we have in place so that we can take advantage of well-meaning corporate citizens like GE and support them to actually deliver on the business plans as part of the just transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anibor, and for providing such really interesting perspectives around sort of the practical challenges and what does it mean for Africa. I know, Farouk, you wanted, and I know we have maybe a couple of more minutes before we go into our next session, so I think we need to wrap it up. But if you have, I think, a small intervention, and Nader, I imagine you too, and then thank you.
I'll try to be brief. I think we've kind of abstracted a bit from the core concept of the just transition, but it's all connected, so let's go for it. I think we also conflate two different things here when we're talking: finance and economics, particularly macroeconomic reform. And we need to be quite clear. Since everything's connected, that's great. But finance is just simply the flows of resources within the system. We also need to change and reform the system itself. To my colleagues' points, particularly on the South Africa case, the 8.5 billion. On the first point, I believe South Africa earns about 11 to 12 billion a year on the coal industry. Why would they take a one-off payment when they make more every year using coal? It just doesn't make any sense. There's a logic here. Moreover, the 8.5 billion is in the form mainly of loans, not grants. My point is, everything's connected. We need to actually see the bigger picture. Climate finance is insufficient without debt reform. There's a sequence and a hierarchy here that we really need to understand if we have any hope of achieving a just transition. My big piece of work has been around environmentally harmful subsidy reform. We have discovered recently that we spend at least $1.8 trillion a year on subsidies that destroy the environment. That's at least. It's an indicative number. It should be seen as a floor, not a ceiling. I think the real number is probably around $6 to $10 trillion a year. There's no lack of money. It's sloshing around the system. It's doing all sorts of bad things. Equally, you cannot introduce a carbon tax unless you address the fossil fuel subsidy portion of that. $600 billion a year we spend on fossil fuel subsidies. To introduce a carbon tax, you would have to compensate for those subsidies. Therefore, you'd have to introduce an artificially high carbon tax. Of inflation, given that's a universal tax, you would trigger hyperinflation. We need to be clever. We look at these things piecemeal. We need to see the big picture and identify things. I could go on. The connections are deep and profound. But in the interest of the panel, I should stop there. The point is, we need to take a much, much bigger view. And we really need to understand the equity element behind all of these things. This is not solidarity. Solidarity is doing whatever you can to your optimal ability and helping others do the same.
Well, I think I'd agree with most of what you've just said. But building on that, I think, as well as what an earlier panelist said, the number is not 100 billion, right? We need trillions of dollars to effect this in a meaningful way. And we need accelerated access to finance. The issue, though, is actually the global system that we have right now is skewed against certain countries. So building on that, in terms of when we look at the debt element, how you're getting finance, developing countries in the first instance are viewed as riskier for the same type of renewable energy projects. Of course, there are reasons for that. And then in terms of the revenues associated, the credit risk markets, the ability to pay, it's compounding. So I think there's one element of the financial system that we have in place, and more broadly, the incentivization is very, very skewed, right? So I think it is that entire element. So again, I agree with you in terms of when we look at where financing is going, fossil fuel subsidies versus looking at how we incentivize renewable energy investments, it's very skewed. And again, the access for developing countries, we require a lot more concerted effort there. And here and again, I think we get caught up by too much generalizations. We cannot speak about this in terms of a global perspective. We need to look at it at a very localized, not even national level, but down to cities in terms of implementation. We have too many gaps. The NDCs as we have it right now are really not cutting it, to borrow your term. You know, when we look then at the policies, they're even between NDCs and policies, it's not really backed up. Policy then into implementation of laws and regulations, that's another huge gap, much less the financing and investment. And the investment and financing will not come unless there is the right enabling environment. And we also never talk about that. An enabling environment doesn't happen overnight. Especially for countries that we've been discussing, you need to have real concerted assistance to develop the right frameworks, to actually have coherent policies that align across all of the elements my fellow panelists have talked about. This doesn't happen overnight, and we need to move away from generalizations and individual help for specific countries that are tailored to their circumstances. I think that's one of the key things that, you know, I would leave it there.
Thank you very much. I think we are
Okay.
running out of time, so we need to wrap up for our next session. But I really want to thank, I think it's been a very interesting and constructive conversation around the subject. So I really want to thank you all, and also our member organizations for being able to convene this dialogue. Thank you very much.
Excellent job. No, you go ahead. You go ahead. Well, we'll try to transition gracefully here. We were supposed to have another speaker, but as things are with this implementation COP, we have to be thinking on our feet and be a little fluid, and so we're just going to have a regular fireside chat here with Erica. I just want to mention a few observations about the previous discussions as we kind of go into this one. The title of this session is nominally Policy and Practical Solutions. So the idea is we had this great discussion with Monica Medina to kind of give us the overall framing, and then the kind of get into the nitty-gritty of what a just transition looks like in the context of resilience and adaptation. You know, so just a few observations on what was said. I think the first thing that I heard a lot of in the last session, and what Monica was talking about, was that a just transition depends on customizing things for particular communities, that you can't do things cookie cutter, one size fits all. That resilience is key to the transition, to get beyond kind of discussions on mitigation, especially in places, in the developing world, like, on the continent of Africa, where you're looking to reduce risks for both companies and communities. Adaptation and resilience is key. Monica mentioned, and kind of to draw on the focus on policy, which we'll try to get into a little bit, the importance of replicating the model that we used in the United States in ratifying the Kigali Amendment, kind of consensus-based bipartisan support for policies. There are things that we can work on together, and so especially on an issue like the just transition, having consensus-based approaches really, really important. And then, the other thing, in that innovation and entrepreneurship is needed, and the focus needs to be, again, on resilience and lifeline infrastructure. Another thing was mentioned, which we might get into a little bit, is skills development, the importance of, the skilling the new workforce. And then finally, kind of public-private partnerships, de-risking the continuum of finance, that it's not as easy as just saying we need to have trillions of dollars, that there's a trajectory that we can get on to get partnerships in place where there's a role for the public and the private sector, and where is each kind of de-risking the other and giving the right kind of capital to get into those, make those investments. So with that, I'll introduce our speaker here today, Erica Mink, who's with, and please help me with this. So it's ThyssenKrupp, is that right? Almost. So go ahead. How does that pronounce?
Yeah. It's ThyssenKrupp.
So ThyssenKrupp. So my German is a little bit rusty today, so I apologize for that. So let's dive in just real quickly. Why don't you talk a little bit about the company and what you're doing, why you're here at COP. It's a hard to decarbonize sector, so how does that relate to the just transition and what you're thinking about and the operations that you work on?
Yeah. No, thank you very much. And I'm really, really excited to be here and to share a bit of where we are coming from. But of course, compared to the previous speakers, we are living and experience a different reality. However, the critical points, are pretty similar. It's about, getting transition roadmaps in place, getting the finance and getting the skills and getting people and infrastructure to implement. So why are we here? Because we agree, it's about implementation, and implementation is right now in the steel industry, like in other industries, and like for government, it's investments. We have the solutions at ThyssenKrupp Steel. We are one of the largest steel producers in Europe, with the biggest, huge integrated sites. We belong to a larger group, which is a ThyssenKrupp Group. It's a conglomerate of companies busy, with steel being one element, but also active in industrial solutions, in material trading, in building electrolyzers and building infrastructure for the hydrogen economy. So in the steel industry, as a primary steel producer, what we need to do, we need to basically rebuild the industry. We need to phase out the current coal-based blast furnace technology with what we call direct reduction. It's a hydrogen-based technology. This means, we have to, parts of the operations, we have to deconstruct and rebuild. And that is a quite capital-intense endeavor. So for our company, we produce about 11 million tons of steel every year. So we have a clear transition roadmap towards climate neutrality by 2045. 2045 is a target set by the German legislation, and we will need around roughly $8 billion in order to manage this transition over time. Right now in Europe, like in many other parts of the world, the energy situation is quite peculiar. So we have skyrocketing prices. We have gas shortage. We will need gas as a bridging technology. So all sorts of uncertainties. We do not know yet how fast the infrastructure for hydrogen will be set up, but we had to take investment decisions now in all these uncertainties, and this comes back to trust. So we need we trust that the support we were promised or we expect from the German government, but also the regulatory framework the European Union is about to put in place, that that's going to happen, and that it's going to happen in a way that it really helps us with the transition, and that it really supports and fosters investments rather than hindering them.
So how do those, what are the barriers to you in making those kinds of investments, and how does that relate to what you think, the relationship to the just transition might be? What is the role of the private sector in doing that?
Yeah, well, in our case, when it comes to legislation, but again, it's a European situation. So what we are right now putting in place as a continent is the legislation to build the infrastructure or to rebuild some of the infrastructure, which basically is scaling up renewable energy and getting a hydrogen infrastructure in place. And we have a tendency in Europe to micro-regulate. So we are now very much looking also to other parts of the world, especially the US, and say maybe we go more for more carrots than sticks. So that's what we are discussing, and try to avoid too restrictive regulation in order to gain speed. When it comes to the just transition, so the way we look at it, and I believe I can speak for the steel industry here in general. So what we look is, of course, at our workforce. And because jobs will change, the jobs we have today will not exist, many of them, in the future. So we are, as a company and as an industry, we already start to reskill, to decide what are the skills our workforce needs to have in the future, and how do we secure those skills. This applies to blue-collar worker, this applies also to white-collar worker, to engineers. And we have in Europe really a shortage, especially for engineers, to help us to build these new technologies and to really put things in place. But also, and this might be a bit specific for Germany and our sector, so we have in our supervisory board, we have equal participation of the unions. So all we do, the transition roadmaps we are having, have been agreed with the unions. And we believe, as part of this conversation, that, and looking at the age pyramid we have in Europe, we believe that we can do this transition about keeping the same without laying off people and keep more or less the workforce we have today. So that's, for our own direct operations, but also we have to look upstream. So we are part of an organization called Responsible Steel, where we look upstream and make sure that, and with certification schemes, so that also, the upstream conditions for us in the value chain, that we have fair conditions and sustainable practices.
Excellent. So you talked a little bit about the importance of essentially rebuilding the sector. How are you thinking about, as you do that, building in resilience into the equation? Resilience is something where you want to think ahead of the next crisis, so it seems like that's a good time to think about those things. How are you working on that, especially with regards to, a really hard to abate sector like steel?
And this is a discussion which has become very virulent in the current situation, where we have learned, what we get if we get too dependent on Russian gas, in the case of Russian gas. So the discussion is about to start in Europe within industry, between industry and governments, to see to see what type of industries and capabilities do we absolutely have to have in Europe. And we believe, for example, the steel industry is system relevant, is system critical, because you need steel for the energy transition, you need steel for the mobility transition, you need steel for infrastructure. So that we say we have to have well, it's still it's not decided yet, but the question is, how much do we need to keep in Europe? And we believe, as a steel industry, of course, that a competitive steel industry and a competitive green steel industry is absolutely essential. And this is why we are working, among others, topics very much also in partnerships to see how can we define green steel, how can we build partnerships, energy partnerships with neighboring countries, and also diversify when it comes to supply, because as Europe we will never be self-sufficient in anything. We are, neither in raw materials nor in energy, so we need to find new partnerships, and that discussion is going on, and it's a very close dialogue between different industry sectors and the governments.
So you mentioned kind of the challenges in figuring out what green steel looks like. Is that part of the European Commission taxonomy? Is that being considered as part of that? Is that not a direction you want to hit?
Well, it is considered by the European Commission's taxonomy, but to make it really operational, you really need standards, internationally agreed standards. And there we believe that the G7 has, together with the International Energy Agency, has provided a very good basis to define what is green steel, what is green cement. It's for other commodities as well, which we hope we can now further develop, and so that we end up with very clear rules and methods to measure carbon intensity of products and materials, which then can be again replicated and included in trade agreements as well.
So in the policy space, whether you're looking at trade agreements or other mechanisms, what are the things on a global basis or regional basis in terms of policies that would be most helpful in doing the things that you need to do?
So we think that one way forward could be, picking up on the climate club that has been put at the table as a proposal by the G7 and especially by Chancellor Scholz, to see if we could frame that as or one aspect of that climate club could be to gather the countries, major steel producing nations, and agree to have decarbonization roadmaps for the steel sector, perhaps for other sectors, national decarbonization roadmaps. Of course, they would look different from country to country, but at least to make sure that each country starts in a systematic way to decarbonize industry, and also to lead to technology transfer. It could lead, to exchange of effective climate policies for the sector, and as well, it could be a platform to further develop the rules and standards to measure carbon intensity of steel.
Are there other, outside of as you work on things outside of the policy realm, are there practical things that the company is doing in order to kind of push your agenda forward here at COP or elsewhere, kind of on climate issues?
Yeah, of course, we are part of the organization where the conversation happens. World Steel being one of them, Responsible Steel, but also we are part of several NGO or partnership platforms. We believe we need also to benefit from the work certain think tanks are doing, because we can only develop the solutions in collaboration. But what we think is, we need to move from discussions to really to actions, and to focus the dialogue really on the practical things that need now to happen, and to have that learning journey together, to share that, because things will not evolve as we plan them. There will be a lot of there's too many uncertainties, but we have to take things step by step and really keep that dialogue. And we try to organize that through platforms with the parts of the NGO community, but also with policymakers.
Excellent. So just like Marty kind of ended his talk with Monica, what's number one on your wish list in terms of solutions that you'd like to see, as we go forward from COP27 to COP28?
The solutions.
Yes, solutions. Yes.
From COP.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we hope from COP that we have really, no further no challenges on the 1.5 decrease. We think that's absolutely, that's set, and that's the limit, as you said, and that we could come to concrete agreements on how we drive, be it a climate club, an alliance of countries, and drive further concrete decarbonization roadmaps for the hard to abate sectors.
Well, thanks so much. I'm gonna. Do we want to keep going? Is it? Are there questions from the audience? I mean, we can take a few. We have a little bit of time here.
Which, in your opinion, are the main challenges that this just transition may face in the steel pathway that you have described? For instance, green jobs, capacity building, dialogue with society, etc.
Yeah, the way I see it, I see three areas. One still will be, finance will be an issue because green steel is not cost competitive today and in the foreseeable future. So there will be new funding mechanisms which we are discussing right now, developing in Europe. One is called contracts for difference, where you find a funding mechanism for the difference between what conventional steel costs compared to what green steel will cost. There are issues around securing long-term supply agreements for green energy, for green hydrogen. There have to be, there are a lot. The investors require security. So in that area, to get the financial mechanisms right, there will be quite some more work to do, which it started, but it will evolve. Then I think in the just transition, it's really to take also in some areas the fear from people, because change is always, it creates fear, it creates uncertainties in communities. That goes for our own workforce. It also goes for the communities where we have to rebuild a certain part of the industry. We have to build infrastructure, so there will be discussions, new pipelines, for example, have to be built. So we are now about to go into early conversations with the communities to make them understand and get their support. So that's what, and then of course to have the skills. So as I mentioned before, we are really short on engineers in Europe. So that's actually right now already is an issue for us and for other sectors in the industry, and at the same time build the capacity for the skills we will need in the future. So these are the three areas we have to focus on.
Other questions? Other comments?
We're passing around the mic. It does feel a little bit like a fireside chat. So thank you for a great presentation, and I think it's such a terrific concluding note for us from the previous discussions. My question for you is, in the just transition plans that you have been working on and implementing, can you talk a little bit about how and where adaptation comes into the picture? How you maybe integrate that in, build that into what the company is working on and sharing with workers, community, etc.? Thank you.
Yeah, right now what we are mainly focusing really on, to get basically to rebuild the plant and get those technologies up and running. But of course we are in discussions with industry partners to see, where does adaptation need to happen along our upstream value chain. That's one area, and then of course we will see also changes in the marketplace, but that discussion is just it's really just about to start for us. In order to get started now and not to lose competitiveness, we had to get under this current uncertainties the investment decisions up and and the investment in place. So that was for us now the absolute priority. Now we have that, we start building, and now we look, go back to the bigger picture.
And Noreen, I would add, Monica Medina, mentioned that for investments in adaptation and resilience, it's a 4-to-1 ROI in many cases. There's data that shows it could be up to 11 depending on what sources you're looking at. So the payback is there for those kinds of investments for both the communities that are doing it and for the businesses that want to reduce that risk. Anybody else want a final word here? Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Erica. Please join me in offering a warm applause for thank you. And we do appreciate you for coming, and we are adjourned.